What's up, you guys? It's your host, Will, coming back for a new episode of the HuntStand Podcast. Before we get to today's Hot Topic podcast, got a special announcement for y'all. You may have seen this already on socials from one of our partners, from ourselves, or you may have gotten an email about this if you're subscribed. But here's your chance to win a custom management plan from our team over here at HuntStand and HuntStand wildlife biologist Brian Murphy, and over $10,000 in gear from our brand partners, including Muddy, Stealth Cam, we've got Evolved Habitats, Buck Bomb, and we've got Walker's Game Ear involved on this. And what that's going to involve is our team is going to visit your property to kickstart a transformation to make your property a buck haven. And so we're going to do that, and we're even going to bring along a production crew to film the action and share it with our HuntStand community. So if you want to win, there's a couple ways you can do this. You need to tell us why your property is a prime candidate for this makeover, and you'll be in the running for a grand prize worth nearly $15,000. So there's a couple of different ways you can do that. You can either do that through a video submission. I'm going to drop the link below to where you can see all this information and more on how to do this, but you can do video submission or written submission. So there's a couple ways you can do that. Check the link out down in the podcast description below. Of all the entrants we get, even if you don't win the grand prize, you're still going to be eligible to win a digital whitetail property management plan from Brian Murphy, plus $1,000 in gear from our partners. So 5 of y'all are going to be selected as finalists that you're going to get to win those things. But then of those 5, you're going to go through a panel of judges that it's going to be a little bit more in depth, and we're going to pick a grand prize winner to get the Mac Daddy big prize of them all. You're going to get a production crew out there. You're going to get Brian Murphy on site, as well as the HuntStand team, to help you turn your property into a buck paradise. So if you don't want to miss out on that, head down to the description in the podcast below. I've got the link for that. Head to that link, get entered. You've got till the end of the month to do this. We're going to be selecting a winner in August, so you want to make sure that you're signed up and tell us why you should win. Make it compelling. Give us some awesome stories. So to today's episode, we've got a hot topic, and that's baiting and supplemental feed stations for deer. This is a pretty controversial topic. There's different viewpoints. We've got people sitting on both sides of the aisle, different sides of the aisle, and there's different viewpoints on this. And so I'm getting 3 different guests on here. We're going to be getting Mr. Josh Dahlke on, who grew up hunting where baiting and feeding for deer really wasn't allowed. There are some exceptions in some areas of where he lived, but for the most part, wasn't allowed. We're going to get his take on it and how his viewpoint of feeding has evolved over his hunting career. Then we're going to get Mr. Josh Honeycutt, who grew up with it. So we're going to get his viewpoint on it. And then to kind of bring it all together and wrap it up, we're going to be bringing that scientific backing. And we're going to be getting Brian Murphy on here to bring that knowledge to the table and what kind of implications there are, and just other rabbit holes that Brian knows and things I don't know. So we're going to be getting those 3 on here today to talk about that. And remember, make sure you're entered to win the HuntStand Total Whitetail Property Makeover. We're talking baiting and feeding. It's going to be a hot topic today. And remember, if you don't have the HuntStand app downloaded, make sure you head to Apple Store or Google Play Store and get that downloaded. We've got the free version, we've got Pro, and we got Pro Whitetail. Thanks again for tuning in to this week's episode of HuntStand Podcast. And here we are, getting started on hot topic, baiting and feeding for deer. All right, dude, let's get this thing started. Josh, welcome back to the podcast. Thanks for your time this morning, man. First and foremost, before we get into it, just give those listeners that don't know you that quick 30,000 foot view, or what I like to call that 30-foot tree stand view, man.
My name is Josh Dahlke. I'm from Minnesota, born and raised, and pretty much just spend most of my time hunting when I'm not working for HuntStand. So not complaining about life right now.
You can't, man. You can't. If you did, nobody would listen. Well, dude, on today's episode, we've got a controversial topic across the industry. And that topic is baiting for deer. And so This is going to be a 3-part episode, if you will. So I'm going to get 3 different takes on this. So I'm going to get your take because you've grown up without baiting in the area that you hunt in. I'm going to get HuntStand contributor Josh Honeycutt to talk to us about it because he's grown up in an area where it's legal. And then we're going to wrap this thing up with our own Brian Murphy to kind of bring that scientific backing behind deer baiting and just kind of the different theories and arguments behind it. So, dude, let's just get into it. So I kind of want to get your take on it, but why is baiting for deer considered controversial in our industry?
Yeah, and before we get rolling on that, I'm excited about this one just because it is one of those things that kind of strikes a nerve with people.
Yeah.
And sometimes I think it's just a matter of education. And so when we started talking about doing this episode and some of the other content that we're going to be running at HuntStand.com, I just thought it'd be a really good thing to cover comprehensively. So we've got this podcast episode. We've got some videos coming out that you're going to be doing from a strategy perspective for your property in Texas.
Mm-hmm.
And we're going to have a full rundown of baiting laws by state that Honeycutt's going to be running on the website. So we got a bunch of different things coming down the pike for this. But it's especially interesting to me because growing up in the Midwest and growing up primarily starting to deer hunt in Minnesota, baiting was it was sort of a thing, but not really. Guys would dump some corn out here and there, or we would have mineral sites, and it was never like as big as it has been down in a lot of the southern states. Like we never had guys with spinners out there with gravity feeders, any of that kind of stuff. Really, it's primarily just been like in the past when it was legal. Maybe guys would dump a corn pile out by their stand once in a while before they went hunting.
Yeah.
But a lot has changed in my lifetime even. And at this point, you can't bait in Minnesota at all. You can't even put out mineral sites. Wisconsin, next door where I do a lot of hunting, that's pretty much shut down to baiting and mineral sites as well. There's still a couple of spots over there where you can do some baiting, but the majority of the state, they've pretty much shut it down. And primary reason being, as far as I understand, is concerns over spreading chronic wasting disease. And I know that in itself is a contentious topic because there's still a lot of information that needs to be learned about it. A lot of research just still kicking off with CWD.
Mm-hmm.
Didn't have a lot of funding in the past, but now it's become such a hot issue across the country, and it's been impacting so many deer herds that they're finally starting to do the research. And I think Brian's probably going to touch on a lot of that when we have him on here in a little while. But from a hunter perspective, just from a straight up like individual, personal, cultural perspective, as somebody who grew up deer hunting, I didn't start traveling to hunt deer until 13, 14, 15 years ago or something like that. And at the time, it's like I hunted deer where I hunted deer at my family's farm. Every once in a while, I'd go over to Wisconsin to some of my relatives' property. But that was just a small little segment of deer hunting that I was familiar with. And of course, when I was younger, I thought I knew it all. And I thought, everybody hunts the way that we do. And I quickly realized that was far from the case. Like, that's one of the cool things about deer hunting that I've learned over the years is like people do it in so many different ways across the country, whether it's just a matter of styles of hunting you have to do based on the terrain, or whether you can grow crops or not, or even just deer density, like down south where some places you can shoot a pile of deer, you can shoot multiple bucks throughout the season. All that stuff was new to me.
Yeah.
And just growing up here, one of the things, like at least from the media I would consume, I knew that I'd watch TV once in a while. You'd see these guys hunting over feeders, hunting over bait piles, and it just didn't sit well with me when I was a younger deer hunter who didn't really spread my wings and like learn from other people and hunt a bunch of different places.
So I want to get your take. What was why did it not sit well with you? That's kind of, I want to talk like when you see that, I'm assuming it was probably like a Texas hunt, right? Like a South Texas,
Yep.
Stereotypical Sendero hunt. What was going through your mind? Like, why didn't it sit well with you?
I just had this vision, or I guess just this thing in my head of how I thought things were supposed to be done. Just because of the way I grew up doing it.
Right.
And that's a very, very narrow-minded approach in a way to think about anything in life, but it especially applies to hunting and this whole baiting topic. What I've come to find out is it's really been, a lot of it has just been like either culturally based or simply a matter of the types of areas where people hunt. Like you talk about Texas and senderos, which is like the classic throw some corn out situation.
Mm-hmm.
Well, why are they doing that? Well, it's because good luck trying to get a food plot in or
Yeah.
trying to grow a quote unquote natural food source. But it was interesting for me because back in the day when I worked at a hunting magazine, I ended up going on my first out of state bow hunting trip. And actually, it was the first trip. It was the first archery whitetail I tagged in my life. On this trip, I went to Oklahoma, and I knew where we were going to be going in Oklahoma. Red dirt country, very arid. Like they can't really grow a whole lot.
Yep.
Knew leading up to the hunt, like that we were going to be hunting over feeders. So I had this kind of like weird anxiety about it. But I'm also one of those people who, regardless of what my thoughts were at the time or how my thoughts have evolved on things, pretty much willing to try anything once, as long as it's legal and ethical and fair chase, which I know that there's a gray area there as well. But I think we all know what I'm talking about. Like if it's accepted and it's right and it's legal, then I'm pretty much willing to try anything
Yeah.
so long as I feel like the animal's being respected. And so I was like, heck, I'm going to go give this thing a shot. And you never know until you try it. How can you have an opinion about something until
Mhm.
you experience it? So I went out there and had an awesome hunt, awesome experience. And that was one of those moments that started to change my perspective, not just on the idea of baiting, but just from a larger perspective. Like it really made me want to experience whitetail hunting in a lot of other different ways than what I had just been doing at home the whole time.
Yeah. See, and that's kind of I've had that same viewpoint being the guy who's grown up getting to use those feeders here in Texas. I went to Ohio and hunted there this year. Of course, they allow baiting, but the first time I went deer hunting without any kind of mineral lick, feeder, or anything was actually the first time. My first out of state hunt with those was with you in Nebraska, and I still had a blast. I mean, just the anticipation of not knowing what was going to come in, sitting on those trails. We were in the heat of the rut. Like it's to me, I still enjoyed it just as much. So it's to kind of go off of what you're saying is it opened my perspective after doing it for a few years growing up with the feeding. It's like, man, I really want to go do deer hunting in all these different states and seeing what they do and experiencing it.
Yeah, and like what you did, with that Nebraska trip, that's another independent, like kind of unique case in itself. Like
Hmm.
that's a state where, as far as I know at this point, we'll see when Josh puts out his article, he'll do a 50 state breakdown of the baiting laws. But unless something has changed,
Yeah.
you can still feed deer in Nebraska. You just can't hunt within 200 yards of a feed or mineral site.
Which is so
So
weird.
the laws are all over the place. I think in some states you can still put out minerals, but they can't have any quote unquote like really like food in them. So if it's a mineral block that has like some crushed corn in it, that's not legit. But if it's just straight up minerals, like a trophy rock or something, I know that there's places where you can still do that, but then you can't put out feed. And then there's other
Hmm.
places like the few remaining little pockets in Wisconsin, you can only put out so much at a time based on the number of acres that you have and all that kind of thing. So you have to be really careful with the red tape of it, especially if you're traveling to hunt. That's something you really need to take into consideration because um, I think a lot of people who travel out of state to hunt for the first time, especially if they're going with an outfitter, assume that they don't have to worry about dotting their I's and crossing their T's and watching out for stuff. And the more you
Yeah.
hunt places, the more you realize it gets very complicated and you have to pay attention to things. So
Big time.
if you end up somewhere and they're baiting and they're not supposed to, and you don't know that, you're still liable if something were to happen.
Hmm.
So you got to be really careful about that kind of stuff. And that's why if you are going to be deer hunting out of state, that article that Josh is going to be putting out will be a nice resource for everybody to go to, just for this one little microcosm of considerations. Like it's one thing just to check off to make sure that you're squared away with what the laws are and stuff.
Right.
But one thing I will say, now that I've hunted in a handful of places where you can bait deer, where it actually does work, because there are other places where it doesn't necessarily work as well. Um, One of the cool things about it is just the amount of encounters you can have with deer during a trip. Like a lot of places where I hunt in the Midwest, it's not out of the question to sit without seeing a deer, or maybe even multiple sits without seeing a deer.
Mm-hmm.
Generally, when you hunt somewhere where they're baiting or running feeders, you're going to see deer. Now, whether you see the deer that you want to shoot, that's a whole different story.
Yes.
But usually like does, younger bucks, younger does and fawns and stuff like that, like you're going to have encounters with deer. But I had this misconception in my head that anywhere you go where they're running a feeder, you're just going to show up and you're not even hunting, you're just shooting. Well, I learned that that's definitely not the case. Feeding can have its own negative implications in terms of how deer operate, turning them nocturnal, all that sort of stuff. I bet you Honeycutt will probably talk about some of that, and so will Brian. But the other thing is with the baiting.
Let me ask you a question. And I'm sure I'm gonna perk some ears when I ask you this, but I feel like, and I might catch some heat for this one, but I feel like the same people who are against baiting are the same folks who bow hunt and look at rifle hunting as if it's not real hunting.
Yeah, I mean, we've got all these different factions within hunting, and I don't think there's anything wrong with that if it's a personal thing. But for me, just like on my views on just about anything in life, especially with politics, it's more the mentality of, don't tread on me, and to each his own. Do what you want to do. Yep. Think what you want to think. Just don't push your agenda. So if you think rifle hunting for deer versus archery is cheating, or I know there's a lot of that in the turkey world. A lot of hardcore turkey bow hunters are like, hunting with a shotgun is cheating. That's fine. If that's the approach that you want to take, go for it. I mean, whatever you want to do to satisfy your own goals, that's cool. But just don't push it on other people. And most importantly, don't even bother sharing your opinion if you don't have the right to have one. And in my opinion, you don't have the right to have an opinion.
Mm-hmm.
You haven't experienced something. I don't care how many articles you read or videos you watch. Most of the time, unless you've actually experienced it or seen it for yourself firsthand, you probably should just pipe down. But Agreed. That's just my take on it.
Agreed. No, I mean, it makes sense. And, I kind of want to come back to what you were talking about earlier. You grew up doing what you did with hunting, not really with baiting, not really being an option. I mean, that people did it, but just in terms of skill it requires to hunt and effectively take an animal, what is your opinion on how baiting affects the skill and experience required to be a successful hunt or hunter?
Well, I mean, skill is kind of a deep rabbit hole to go into, but if you want to just talk about like effort and the amount of work and consideration, there's a few different ways to look at that too. There's a cost to running feeders or baiting deer,
big time,
in both money and time. So if you want to factor that into it, I mean, that's one way to look at it. Like, what's harder, me having to go refill a feeder every week or two, or me showing up to a property once a year and shooting a deer? Like, I mean, what's going to put you out there more and give you more of a connection with the land and have you out there just enjoying the full experience more? I mean, there's different ways to look at it. A good parallel to that, even more intensely, is like, I know we're talking about whitetails, but I had the same feeling about baiting bears and doing a baited bear hunt before I did it.
Yeah.
I was very apprehensive about it. And then I did it, and now I want to hunt bears over bait like at least every other year. It's a lot of fun, and there's a lot more that goes into it than you might realize at first glance. And again, going back to the thing with encounters, I think most hunters out there, one of the biggest measurements for success in a hunt is having encounters with animals. It's not necessarily shooting one, but if you go on a hunt and you see a bunch of animals, you're probably going to be satisfied even if you go home empty-handed. If you go on a hunt and you don't see anything, that just sucks. So that's one thing where, you're hunting in Texas, Oklahoma, a lot of the southern states where baiting and feeding is more ingrained in the culture of hunting. In my experience, a lot of times you're going to have a lot of those encounters. And also a lot of those areas just tend to lend themselves to higher deer densities. So naturally you're more likely to see animals. Whereas up here, in the Midwest and whatnot, the deer densities might not be as high and this and that. And there's bigger timber, there's more areas for them to hide and concentrate and that sort of thing.
Yeah.
But what I was going to say that I meant to mention before is what I've realized more than anything. You talk about like this baiting thing. I still think the number one factor that is going to influence a hunt and whitetail activity over everything is pressure and human activity.
Absolutely.
So like, as you know, being down in Texas, like you might have a mature buck that is coming to your feeder, but he can pattern you pretty quick. He might show up every time you're not there, or he might only show up during the night and then spend the rest of his time daylighting somewhere else because he knows that that's probably not somewhere where he should be spending his time during daylight.
Mm-hmm.
So I think the impact of pressure is always the most important consideration, no matter what style of hunting you're doing. So I guess with baiting, there's two ways to look at that. I mean, yes, you can condition animals to come to a spot. If you're hunting bucks during the rut, it's all about the does. If you can get does congregating to a spot, odds are a buck is probably going to slip up at some point. But then, on the flip side of that, it's like a lot of these deer do become wise to it. And I know that like up here, for instance, like I mentioned, those few spots where you can still bait in Wisconsin, a lot of the what people complain about is they maybe don't want to run bait, but they feel like if they don't, their neighbor is going to hold all the deer.
Yes.
Even if it means that the deer are still spending time on your property, but their pattern leads them into your neighbors a lot of the time, whether they're doing it at night or what. What I'm getting at is that a lot of people complain that it can change their patterns to the point where it makes it almost impossible for them. So, man, there's all these different considerations with it. It's not black and white. It's not throw out a corn pile and you start shooting more deer and big bucks and this and that. Like there's a lot that goes into it, a lot of considerations, a lot of strategy to do it right, and considerations of sometimes maybe it's not in your best interest, even if you are in somewhere like Texas. Like there might be a situation where it is a complete disadvantage. That's the kind of stuff that Josh is going to cover when he talks more strategy. And of course, there's the biological implications that Brian is going to get into that really need to trump everything else.
Yes.
If science determines that it has a negative impact on a deer herd or other wildlife, then we shouldn't be doing it. So I'm really curious to see what Brian has to say about that, kind of the latest information. I know that there's been stuff coming out lately, echoing down the hallways of turkey hunting about whether some of these feeders are having a negative impact on turkey populations, both with some disease issues and the fact that you're congregating a bunch of predators and nest predators and you're giving them a food source, an easy food source. If you got, 20 raccoons and a bunch of possums and stuff that are spending more time on your property because there's a feeder there, might be impacting nesting turkeys and turkey populations. So it's not just thinking about your deer hunt. It's not just thinking about the deer. It's thinking about the other wildlife species too. So it's going to be really interesting to hear Brian get into all that stuff.
Oh, absolutely. I mean, just to kind of speak on growing up in Texas myself, I mean, you saw last year, I mean, just the struggle I went through trying to kill a couple of deer last year. I mean, we just had one of those years, and most of the time those deer have been used to a cattle rancher out there moving around, used to cows, and so you could usually slip in areas fairly easily, and a lot of times deer just associated it with probably the cattle rancher that they'd gotten comfortable with, or cattle. Cows weren't out there last year, and I mean, we had to be very specific about how we moved into places, and bucks would go nocturnal in those areas on us, and it was just a whole conundrum of being a challenging year. And then to kind of speak on the predator issue, the thing I like about it is it concentrates those raccoons and other predators for us because it makes it easier for us to target them and take them out, you know? So, I mean, there's different viewpoints on it. So yeah, I'm definitely interested to talk to Josh and Brian on this and kind of see what rabbit holes we go down with that. But yeah, I mean, this is definitely a topic I'm looking forward to just opening up cans of worms on, man.
Yeah, I mean, and the whole purpose of this is we want there to be constructive conversation around it.
Yes.
And it's not trying to point people one way or the other. It's let's look at some different perspectives. Most importantly, let's look at the facts that Brian is going to bring to the table. And I mean, from a larger perspective, one can only hope that most states can continue to rely on scientific wildlife management versus some of the stuff we see with ballot initiatives and whatnot, where the public get to make decisions about wildlife. That's a slippery slope, and generally, it's proven to not be for the benefit of wildlife. It's proven to be for the benefit of special interest groups.
Mm-hmm.
Wildlife management should be based on science. There's
Yes.
no question about it as far as we're concerned,
Yep.
and that's why HuntStand partners with groups like Sportsman's Alliance. I mean, they go to DC to fight against this type of stuff all the time because
Mm-hmm.
at the end of the day, whether you like to hunt a certain way or I like to hunt a certain way, or we do this in this part of the country and that in this part of the country, at the end of the day, we all need to be looking out for the animal and the populations of wildlife, not our own personal interests. And so it should be everything should be based on the foundation of science. Science is continually changing, but one of the biggest challenges that we see is the ability for like the legislative process and rules to catch up fast enough with some of the recent science.
Yes.
So that's one of the things that it's kind of that's where the water gets a little bit murky and it gets kind of dangerous at times. I feel like sometimes the research surfaces and then the states maybe can't catch up fast enough to push things through, because there's also back to the cultural thing, like let's say a state is going from baiting to no baiting or vice versa. When a state department, wildlife department, has to make a determination about how they're going to rule on that for a law, yeah, science is usually the thing that dictates it, but there are political undertones and cultural undertones with the voting populace that help make those decisions as well. So
Yeah.
that's why it's important for the average person to be more educated versus just going off what they think is right. And so hopefully forums like this give people the information they need to make the right decisions, to vote the right way for the sake of the wildlife. And I guess before we roll out and get to Josh and Brian, I want to flip the script on you a little bit. Like, we've sort of breezed over, like, we've got my perspective hunting up here a lot in the Midwest.
Mm-hmm.
Baiting is not as common. It's a little bit stigmatized at times. And also let's look at the landscape up here. Like, we've got millions of acres of food in the ground every year. We've got corn, we've got soybeans, we've got all these different row crops. We've got guys who have the dirt where they can plant food plots.
Yeah.
We've got big timber, lots of natural browse and forage and oak trees and this and that. Like, there's a reason why baiting, in areas like this never became as prevalent as it did in other areas, like down many of the states down south. So it's a matter of what the landscape can accommodate to give you a good chance at success and having a good hunt. But we've breezed over talking about like my experience in Oklahoma and what you got going on down in Texas. Explain that. Like, for you, it's probably always been part of just how you hunted, but like, just kind of give people an idea of what that's like and like what the thought is around it.
Hunting down here in Texas.
Yeah, I mean, having feeders and
Hmm.
mineral sites, and like, even I got, it might be helpful to people to explain the difference between just like straight up feeders and like protein feeders, for instance. Like,
Yeah.
there's different things we're trying to accomplish.
Well, I mean, the big thing for us is, I mean, this year I think I can't remember if it's El Nino or La Nina, whatever the weather cycle is right now. So we've had a pretty unusually high amount of rain this time of year, which is great for antler growth. We've got fawns hitting the ground, but typical year for us is it's dry. So we can't have those food plots. We can't have those cornfields, those, soybeans. We can't have everything that y'all do up there. I mean, you can, but you're going to have a lot of it for help from the government, but then there's going to be lots of watering you're going to have to do with digging wells, and that's a whole nother wormhole in itself. But basically, it's so dry here that I can't really put a food plot in on my place that is going to bring in deer. So that's why we choose to use feeders. We've got the corn feeders, we've got the gravity fed protein feeders, and we do that to help concentrate deer into an area, just like y'all do up north with food plots. And I have a question for you in a little bit that I'm going to ask Josh the same thing. But we do that because we just don't have that luxury like you guys do up there. So, I mean, even though I've got these feeders, I've got these protein feeders, I've got, mineral blocks, I've got mineral sites set in areas, doesn't mean I'm always going to be successful. Sure, I'm going to see deer come in when that feeder goes off. It's essentially ringing the dinner bell for them, lack of better terms. They hear that and they come in. I still have deer come in before and after, but that's just how I was raised to hunt here. Otherwise, it's very tough because lots of tracks here, small tracts of land. When you start getting further down in the South Texas area below San Antonio, what they call the Golden Triangle, you get into big ranches, thousands and thousands of acres. So it gets so thick in areas, can't have those food plots. So you've got to bait the roads. You've got to have feeders in areas to bring those deer out so you can get an opportunity at them. And so it's in my opinion, there are some differences, but there's a lot of similarities. And that's why the last question I want to ask you before we run out of time here, which I'm going to ask Josh the same thing, or Honeycutt the same thing. We got Josh squared here. But
Yeah.
I always call him Honeycutt and you're Dahlke. But in your mind, what is the difference between hunting on a feeder and hunting a food plot? Sure, one might be broadcasting it, but you're sitting over a
That's,
food or bait source. What's the difference? You're concentrating deer in an area, right?
yeah, man, that's a great point. Actually, the very first article I wrote after I shot that deer in Oklahoma many, many, many years ago on a feeder, um, I think that was almost an exact quote in my article. What's the difference of shooting a deer over standing corn in a food plot that you planted
Mm-hmm.
versus shooting a deer over a pile of corn that you dumped out? I mean, like you said, either way, it's the same, different means to the same end.
Right.
Um, and back to just the brass tacks of it. I kind of probably mumbled around a little bit about it, but I think in a lot of cases it can actually make the hunting more difficult.
Yes.
Either from the perspective of altering natural patterns in a bad way that you can't hunt around, that you can't necessarily crack the nut on, making deer nocturnal. And then the other thing that I've noticed in the times where I have hunted places where you can bait or where there's feeders, man, especially if you're bow hunting, those deer can be so ridiculously keyed up when they come in, to the point where if you even just snap your finger, those things, they're so jittery and so jolty. And I remember another time that I was trying to kill a whitetail over a feeder down in Texas. I had probably 25 deer around me, and I mean, I was in a ground blind, completely blacked out. I just had a little slit in the window open in front of me to be able to shoot. And I put my release on my D loop, I just started to tense up my elbow to draw back. And that moment where I just started to draw, I mean, I must have moved a half inch. And those deer, they just knew. They knew something was
Mm-hmm.
up. And I had sat there for 3 hours that morning. All these deer congregated around me. There wasn't a deer that I wanted to shoot. And then finally this buck showed up. And they were so keyed up that just that smallest little movement in a blacked out ground blind, and they were gone for the rest of the morning. I mean, so it's anybody who thinks it's you just roll up and someone walks out there and dumps out a pile and the deer come running and next thing you know you shoot a 150-inch buck. It's just so far from the truth, at least in the experiences that I've had. So
Yeah.
ups and downs, man.
Yeah, I mean, yeah, we still experience the same ups and downs here. I mean, I've had that happen to me before where sure I'd had some corn that I'd thrown out. Actually wasn't sitting on a feeder 2 years ago, and I had gotten up in a saddle about 15 feet up in the air up in a cedar tree of all things, and just kind of I knew there was this certain corridor of our place that these deer were constantly traveling, and for whatever reason they were choosing to. We had some browse that was coming up. I think it was leftover oats from the year before from the cattle rancher that was raising up oats to bale it. And I think we had some leftover I think secondaries, what they call it, had started to come up. So they were choosing that in preference over my feeders. And I knew this travel corridor that they were coming into, but I'd thrown some corn out there just to try and concentrate them and get them to stop. Had actually this buck right here behind me come in 16 yards, starts eating on the corn, but he was already keyed in and he was wary as all get out. And same thing happened to me. I mean, I just drew back, got to there, bolted, and thought he had stopped at 41, aimed like he was at 47, shot right over his back, and actually ended up killing him a couple weeks later with my rifle. But yeah, I mean, either way, I mean, it's there's a ton of different takes and ways to look at it, but in my opinion, it's still hunting. I mean, this past year went to Ohio, sat on food plots, and I saw the same amount of deer that I would see here in Texas. I mean, they were on a food source, had a great time, and I would definitely go back and do it in a heartbeat.
Well, and then the other thing you talk about, especially with hunting smaller parcels where you're running feeders, back to our point about pressure trumps everything.
Mm-hmm.
The best thing you can do to hunt a deer is go in and try to hunt it once. Make it your goal to only have to hunt it once. Make sure everything is right. Of course, it never works that way, or hardly works that way, and we do have to spend more time out there and get them educated a little bit more every time. But dude, I couldn't imagine if you're hunting a small parcel where you got a couple feeders, like every single time you go out there, and especially if you have the same feeders year after year, I've seen it where those deer come in and the first thing they do is look up, and if you got a tree stand, the first thing they do is look up in that stand. Like they know where the stand is. So it's like it becomes even more difficult at that point because they just, and that'll happen even if you sit a stand too much for bait, no bait. Anytime you sit a stand too much, the deer just become wise to it. And I feel like they can pass that on too. Like they pass it on. Like a lot of guys, they'll hang a stand in a spot. They'll have that same stand up every year. They'll hunt the hell out of it. Yeah, maybe they'll get lucky once in a while, or maybe they'll kill one before they really key into them. But overall, like those deer wise up on stuff real quick. And so, yeah, the baiting thing definitely presents its own set of challenges.
1000%, man. Well, dude, I know we're out of time. I'm going to be getting Honeycutt on here next. So just want to thank you for your time this morning and just talking to us about baiting and giving us your viewpoint on it.
Heck yeah. I'm going to stick around now and listen and see what Josh and Brian have to say. So thanks for having me on.
All right, man. Well, Josh, dude, first and foremost, welcome back to the HuntStand Podcast. You've been on a couple times already. So those returning listeners of ours, they know who you are. But for those that don't, give them that quick 30,000-foot view, that 30-foot tree stand view of yourself, man.
Yeah, Kentucky redneck that shoots deer and writes about it.
I love it, man. That's probably the quickest and briefest description I have gotten on the podcast yet.
There you go.
Perfect. Well, let's keep it at that, man. So, this is gonna kind of be a 3-part podcast, and you're the middle ground of it, and so you're the second part to the equation of this, and we're talking controversial topic, baiting for deer. And first question I want to ask you, man, is in your mind, in your opinion, and what you've seen out there, why is it considered controversial in the hunting community?
As for why, is because the United States is so culturally different.
Mhm.
There's so many places that, every state has its own hunting laws.
Yeah.
And therefore, its hunters they have their own sets or lists of ethical practices. And depending on where you go will determine whether hunting over bait or baiting deer or whatever variation or form of baiting, whatever description you want to put on it, however it's being applied. Wherever you go, what state you're in, and even counties within states that you're in, will determine if that's considered obviously a lawful tactic, but even below that, an ethical tactic. And some hunters will deem it completely ethical, and some hunters will deem it completely unethical.
Got it, man. So let's talk about where you are. You're in Kentucky, correct?
Mm-hmm.
Let's talk about your baiting laws. You are allowed to do it, and so talk about how it has benefited you as a hunter in helping you be successful, and just kind of the strategy that you've used in baiting whitetail.
Yeah. It's not like a primary tactic for me.
Mhm.
Never has been. It's more of a supplemental tactic
Yeah.
when used. And that's not something that I always use, but I have used it. And excuse me. And as long as, it's legal, we'll continue to use it from time to time, depending on the situation. Here in Kentucky, it is permitted outside of our CWD surveillance zone. We still don't have CWD in Kentucky that we know of, but there is a CWD surveillance zone in southwestern Kentucky. It's a 5-county area that was established as part of the emergency response plan a couple of years ago whenever it was detected 8 miles across the state line in Tennessee. So CWD 8 miles away, there's a high chance that if it's not already in Kentucky, it soon will be. What happens then as far as our baiting laws are concerned, who knows? But for now, it's only permitted or not permitted within that surveillance area. So inside of that 5-county area, you cannot bait in Kentucky. Outside of that surveillance area, you can bait in Kentucky. And so I'm outside of that surveillance area, and so I'm able to. I'm about an hour and a half away from there, so I'm not even close to that surveillance zone. So I'm able to do it. Have been able to do it. We'll continue to be able to do it at least for this next season. Per the laws. One thing that they did change this year in Kentucky was when you could bait. So in the past, you could not feed wildlife from March 1st until I think it was May 31st. Until June 1st. So there was like basically turkey season window. And we don't hunt turkeys throughout that entire window, but they didn't want people feeding turkeys.
Yeah.
And so that was kind of the only time of year that you really couldn't do it. Now they have extended that to where you can't start feeding wildlife until August 1st. So you can still feed during the season, again, outside of the surveillance zone. So that is the way it stands in Kentucky. I also hunt in Ohio. Haven't checked their laws for this coming year, but I think it's still legal to hunt deer over bait up there and to feed wildlife up there outside of their own CWD surveillance area, which is up in the northeastern part of the state, I think. So those are the two areas that I hunt the most, and I guess have to pay attention to the regulations the most regarding bait.
Absolutely, man. That's a big thing for all the listeners out there. Make sure you check that before you do bait. And
and they change regularly.
Yes, yeah, they change all the time. And I know we've got an article that's out or it's coming out soon on the HuntStand Field Notes page that it's gonna have a lot about that information with different baiting regulations across multiple states. And so, there's two sides to this spectrum. There's those that are in favor of it and those that are against it. And so I kind of want to talk to you, to ask you, what are the arguments in favor of deer hunting? I mean, let me rephrase that. What are the arguments in favor of deer baiting?
Yeah. You know, there, in my opinion, so I'm just an everyday guy. I don't own land. I'm fortunate to lease quite a bit of hunting land, so I get to lease some properties, hunt a lot of private properties that are managed for deer. Some of those I can plant food plots, some I can't. Some of the properties that I hunt by permission, I can put food plots on. Some I can't. Really, in my opinion, I'm primarily a food plot guy. If I can plant a food plot, that's 100% what I'm going to do.
Yeah.
Just because I love to work the land, I love to manage the land. It is healthier for the deer from numerous perspectives. It's just all around a better option. And so, whenever I'm able to do that, that's what I do. In lieu of baiting or instead of baiting. But not everybody can do that. So. Right. Not everyone either has the property. They don't own property, and sometimes they do own the property, but it's not conducive to food plots. You got big timber areas. A lot of like for example, I hunt in southeastern Ohio. That area is mountainous country. A lot of times, you don't even have anywhere you can even potentially think about putting a food plot, unless you go in with seriously heavy machinery and clear out ground. Not everyone, even if they own land, can put in food plots. Obviously, there's other options. Deer are still going to eat. Deer don't live and die off bait. Alone. They can die from bait, which I guess I'll talk about a little bit here in a minute. And I know our resident deer biologist will expand on that even further. But yeah, so I guess the biggest things in favor of baiting is sometimes that's their only option for people. And if you're hunting a small tract of land, say you only have 5 acres or 10 acres, and you don't have a food source on that property that deer are coming to, you're just out of luck, period. If the deer's lines of movement on that tract of land or in that area are not, crossing through that 5 or 10 acre or 20 acre, 50 acre, whatever it is, if the lines of movement aren't going through that property, you're just out of luck if you don't have something that they need. Let's just bedding cover, food sources, water sources, or all three. So, baiting can help level the playing field for people who do not have as good of a property. And let's be honest, most of the time when you're looking at, say, a 2 or a 3 square mile area, there's always going to be a 50-acre section that just holds the bulk of the deer.
Yeah.
Because those areas are supreme in regards to bedding cover, food sources, water sources. And for that landowner or land manager or leasee or whoever is benefiting from that, that's great for them, but it's bad for everybody else in the area. So some places aren't so much like that. You have more diversified habitat. The quality is more spread out instead of being, more concentrated. But some places, and a lot of places that I have hunted, the deer are concentrated because the habitat quality is concentrated. And so if you're able to bait, sometimes that can level the playing field. So that's really the number one thing. The other argument that I give for it is that it's cultural in a lot of places. I mean, you're from Texas. I mean, baiting is life in Texas.
Big time, dude. Because, it's so dry. You really can't do food plots down here. Unless we just have a really wet year like we kind of are this year, but it's a coin toss, man.
Yeah. And so you're a prime example of how the geographical location restricts the ability to plant food plots. You're not even really so much in hills, mountainous country. You probably got some hills, but
yeah,
like in Ohio where I hunt and it's mountain country, you just really can't plant food plots. You're in Texas, it's dry, you can't really plant food plots. There's a lot of different places throughout the country, especially in the more extreme habitat types, that you just can't plant food plots. And so in those areas, if legal, baiting can serve as an alternative option to food plots. And so, yeah, there's several things there in an age where deer hunter numbers are declining. Baiting, and let me throw this out there too, baiting doesn't just immediately make deer hunting easier at all.
No, it does not.
If baiting is done improperly or carelessly, it can actually hurt your chances. of being successful at filling tags. So the people, oftentimes what I hear from people who can't bait or come from states that don't permit it, they say, "Oh, it makes it so much easier. You're not even having to hunt." That is not true. This is me coming from a state that has let me bait my entire life. Just because you throw corn out does not guarantee you a field tag, even on a non-mature animal, such as a young buck or a young doe. Yes, in some instances it can make things easier, but in the grand scheme of things, if you're targeting mature whitetails, at times, and I'm a firm believer of this, sometimes it can even hurt your chances on a mature whitetail, because a buck that's lived 5, 6+ years old in even 3.5 or 4.5 years old in a state that permits baiting, they learn what bait piles are. It's not all of them, and because they all have different levels of tendency, or different levels of apprehensiveness when it comes to stuff like that, and they all have different personalities, quotation mark personalities, but they all have different levels of tolerance to human intrusion, and some of them are probably smarter than others. So some of these deer that are really mature, they become very familiar with what a bait pile is, and it can, I think, can make you less likely to fill a tag. Some bucks that I've hunted throughout the years, they were all about that bait. They loved it. They ate it, slurped it up, and they really didn't have a lot of apprehensiveness toward it. But then there's been other deer that I was particularly targeting and put out that bait pile, and then I got one picture of them over that bait and never saw them again. So I'm jumping all over the place with this because there's so many different directions that you can go when you're talking about bait. But by and large, I would say that the things that I've mentioned are the biggest arguments for it.
Yeah, and one of the things you talked on a second ago with food plots. And I'm kind of thinking from the mind frame of somebody who may not necessarily be a hunter, or they're just getting into it. And how can you? I'm trying to think how to phrase this correctly, but thinking about the person that's not done this before, and you're talking about a bait pile compared to a food plot. Essentially, with the food plot, you've got your food source from that. So coming from the perspective of maybe just a green hunter, it's like, how is that not baiting?
Yeah. And as far as in regard to a food plot.
Yeah.
I mean, you've heard that concept before, how is a food plot not baiting? In my opinion, if you're sitting there with a rifle, and you can cover 100 yards, they're really from a concept, if you really just drill it down, there isn't a whole lot of difference in your effectiveness as a hunter between, say, you're setting in a clearing, you've got like a half-acre field, and you're setting in your tree stand. Say that entire half-acre field is planted in a food plot. That's scenario one. Scenario two is you're sitting in that exact same spot, but there's no food plot, and you've got a pile of corn in the middle of it. You're not going to be more or less effective as a deer hunter with either of those two options, when you're just purely boiling it down to comparing the difference between a food plot and a corn pile.
Yeah.
Obviously there are differences, but from an effectiveness standpoint, there's not much difference. Now you might have individual deer that like the taste of brassicas better than shell corn, or vice versa. So, but in the grand scheme of things, it's really not that much different. Now, obviously the differences come in from legal perspectives, obviously, but also from health perspectives. Wholeheartedly, a pile of corn that's the size of a pickup truck bed area is going to be less healthy than a half-acre food plot that's spread out over that half-acre field, because deer aren't so concentrated. They're concentrated, but not as concentrated. And so to that point, what I do when I bait deer in areas that permit it, because obviously I'm not going to bait deer unless the laws allow. But when I do, I don't put it in a pile. That's what I used to do.
Yeah.
But from a health perspective standpoint, I do not do that anymore, and haven't for quite some time. I spread that bait out over a pretty large area. So, for example, whenever I put corn out for deer, if I'm putting out shelled corn, I don't just take those 50-pound bags of shell corn and just dump them in a pile. I used to do that, but I don't do that anymore, especially since all the knowledge of CWD, even though we don't have it here yet, but even other illnesses that deer can get from one another that are communicable from being in close contact with one another. So I broadcast that out, and I use my four-wheeler. So, I've got a cedar on the back of my four-wheeler, and it holds a 50-pound bag of corn, and I dump that corn in there, and then I drive around while it spreads it out. So you got little bitty kernels of corn that are really dispersed. And so in that regard, spreading out 3 or 4 bags of shell corn over a half-acre area then becomes absolutely no different than a half-acre food plot planted in brassicas or whatever you're planting. From a health perspective standpoint, unless, which we'll probably talk about later, if you're suddenly introducing that corn in the middle of winter, whenever it's going to seriously disrupt their digestive system, which is a completely different discussion.
Yeah, well, yeah, that's a whole nother wormhole in itself. And yeah, I mean, basically, just kind of hearing you and your thought process behind it all, it's more or less just about the placement of the food that makes it the main difference. So, what would you say then? What are the arguments against deer bait? What are the arguments against deer baiting and, the potential negative consequences from it?
Yeah. Well, a lot of people say, in the states where, like Kentucky, where it is permitted, but people don't like it, because there's still people who don't like it in states that it's permitted.
Yeah.
There's well, we're forced to bait because our neighbors are. Well, in some regards, that is true. If your neighbors are doing it and you're not, you're at a disadvantage.
Welcome to Texas.
Yeah. But here's the thing, oftentimes the ones who are really, who make that argument are people who have really manicured properties. They have really good properties. They put in food plots. They've managed, they do a lot of TSI work, whatever it is.
Yeah.
They put in a lot of effort. And then, but then their neighbors come in, don't do any of that type of work. Their neighbors come in, a few weeks before season, start dumping out corn. And so they just don't, that's really what it boils down to. But here at the end of the day, deer hunting is not a competition. Deer hunting is not just for the wealthy. Deer hunting is not just for the super committed either, who like to do a bunch of land management. Deer hunting is for everybody. And so the people who try to make that argument have no right, simply on that basis alone. Just because you choose to do a lot of work on your property, and I'm that guy. I like to do a lot of food plot work and stuff like that whenever I have, because I don't own my own land, but I do have permission to do stuff like that on properties that I help manage. So
yeah,
and hunt. So even as a guy who has done both sides of that, the guy who has really actively managed a property and the guy who's just went out and dumped some corn out on a property that I've done nothing else to, that really isn't a good argument. So that's really the first argument that a lot of people try to use against it, especially in states where it's already permitted. Now, obviously, in other instances, you do have the disease, and that's the big one. That's the one that a lot of state agencies use when they're trying to outlaw bait.
Right.
It's the one that hunters use when they're trying to advocate against it. And that is a concern. So when you have diseases out there, especially with chronic wasting disease, that is a deer-to-deer disease, and other ones, there are other things out there too. I know in Kansas they have some problems with foot rot. That's a deer-to-deer disease, sort of. It's not usually deer-to-deer. It's like deer to ground a deer. But there's a lot of diseases that deer get, and they can pass on to one another. So bait in those instances can be an issue,
right? Especially
if it's very, very condensed in a pile or around a feeder. It's a very small, condensed, confined area. But deer are very also, in that same regard, deer are also very social animals. They are going to spread disease whether there is bait there or not. especially during the rut. There was some research that just came out, and Brian may talk about this later in the podcast. I'm not sure. And I forget the source that even put it out there. It's very recent. I'm sure that anybody that wanted to find it could go out there and Google search it. But anyway, basically, there was some new research that just came out. They had the ability, whereas it was not, the technology wasn't quite there yet. I don't think. Now they have the ability to test for prions in the soil, and test for prions on other materials. So the research came out and just determined that there is measurable numbers of prions in scrapes, both in the soil on the ground, as well as on the licking branch above the scrape. And I don't know if those were prevalent enough numbers to be a serious threat to deer. But the point is, deer are coming in direct contact with one another, especially during the rut, whenever they're tending does and stuff like that. But even indirectly via those scrapes, which is almost condensed as much as a bait pile would be.
Yeah.
And the same concerns are present, but because I know everybody talks about bait piles, well, the saliva. Well, that's true. But if a deer can get CWD from saliva from a bait pile, they're also going to get CWD from saliva on a licking branch. And all deer use licking branches. If you're worried about the feces, deer pooping around at the corn pile, I found a lot of droppings around scrapes too.
Oh, yeah.
If you're worried about urine on the ground around bait piles, well, there's a lot more urine in scrapes. So at the end of the day, it's still going to happen. Yes, it's all about reducing the likelihood and reducing that, but you've got to measure the pros and cons of that when you're questioning whether or not to outlaw baiting based on that basis alone. You've got to think about the economic impact. Baiting brings a lot of money, not only to local economies, but more importantly, in this discussion, to conservation.
Yep.
And in some instances, depends on how it's purchased and where it's purchased and stuff like that. But it also brings a lot of money to the deer hunting industry as well. And the deer hunting industry, in turn, donates a lot of money, especially when you're considering some of these bait companies that produce baiting. They donate so much money to wildlife conservation. So you got to factor in a lot of stuff that surrounds that. And so I guess that would be my main argument against those who would say that baiting should not be implemented. And I am in favor of baiting. You can tell that by I have a bias, and I will readily admit that, because I don't think that baiting alone should be banned simply because of certain situations.
Right. And, and I'm kind of in the same mindset as you, where I have that biased mindset that, that's how it is in Texas. Our neighbors, unfortunately, our neighbors, they've got feeders like 50 yards from our fence. Not cool. But, if we want to try and concentrate deer on our side and keep them over on our property and have a chance at shooting a mature buck, we have to. But then at the same time, I enjoy going to states like Nebraska, sitting in a tree stand all day with no bait, no mineral sites, no feed, no nothing, and just waiting for that buck to walk by. Like, I love doing both of them, and they're both equally challenging. This past year, I had feeders out at my place, and it took me actually 2 weeks worth of sitting in the stand before I could kill a doe. We were trying to film a project, and we were just simply trying to get a doe. Of course, the does didn't want to cooperate. All the young bucks were coming out. That's how it works. And it's challenging either way. And yes, there are some instances where you've got certain pieces of property with high fence that it can be a lot easier. But there's always two sides of the story. And so you pretty much answered my last question. There was give us your kind of overall feel on it, and you gave me the answer I was looking for, man.
Yeah. And there's a lot of states that permit baiting or don't permit baiting, permit baiting, but they permit mineral sites.
Yes.
And that is just an absolute contradiction like no other.
I've never understood it.
Yeah. So there's, take Missouri. Missouri is a walking contradiction. I deer hunt in Missouri.
Yeah.
Have deer hunted Missouri. It's been a few years, but I've deer hunted there quite a few times.
Yeah.
And And so it's like there, they permit mineral sites, but they do not permit baiting.
Yeah.
What is the difference between a corn pile and a mineral site? To be honest with you, nothing. Especially if you're putting mineral out during the growing season,
Mm-hmm.
when bucks are growing antlers, when does are raising fawns. Those are the times, the spring and summer months, the late winter to late summer months, especially or midsummer months is when deer are really targeting mineral licks the most. And so that's like, I don't know, 6 months out of the year that deer are actively hitting mineral licks. And oftentimes these are even smaller than a bait pile, more condensed than a bait pile. And so the states that use disease as the means of outlawing baiting, but not also simultaneously outlawing mineral licks, that just doesn't make sense. So it's one of those things where if you're gonna outlaw baiting from a health perspective for deer, you have to outlaw minerals as well.
Yeah,
mineral licks.
Yeah,
because mineral licks honestly are of more of a risk than baiting is, because bait can be spread out, as we talked about earlier. Mineral can't. Mineral has to be condensed. You can't spread that out. Not effectively.
Well, and I feel like with those mineral sites too, there's going to be more saliva involved with that. Wouldn't you think so?
Yeah, because there's more licking of the ground.
Yeah.
Mineral licks are 100%. I mean, it doesn't take much logical reasoning. It doesn't take critical thinking to quickly like, oh yeah, mineral licks are a bigger concern than bait piles are when it comes to disease and deer and spreading those diseases to other deer. And so there are so many problems out there when it comes to the states that do outlaw baiting. If you're going to do it, and I'm not here to call anybody out, but do it from an intelligent basis. Come on.
Yeah.
Don't, and there are plenty of states who have outlawed both mineral and corn. And if they want to make that argument, then okay, that's fine. I also do think that there should be provisions, though, because if again, from a common sense standpoint, and some states do have provisions on baiting. So I think there should be provisions and options there if you're going to outlaw baiting, that it has to be done in a way that is same as a food plot. But I know a lot of that comes down to how do you police it and how do you enforce it. But it still could be enforced for sure, in my opinion. And honestly, I don't think it would be a bad idea for states that permit baiting still to make that a provision to where you can't dump it in a pile, that it has to be broadcast out over a certain area. Again, there's a lot of gray there, and how do you measure it? But still, I feel like that would be a good thing for the deer herd in states that were still going to permit baiting.
Yeah, it seems like definitely a much more common sense thing to do, for sure. 1,000%. Well, man, dude, it's been enlightening to get to listen to your perspective on this. We've got boss man Josh got his perspective right before this, and then we're going to be bringing in Brian Murphy, who's on our team, to kind of bring it all together, because he's going to have a lot of science-based knowledge to talk about all this. So, man, just really appreciate your time today and talking about this controversial topic.
Yeah, I appreciate it. Like I said, I'm just a redneck from Kentucky that likes to shoot deer. But I will sum up and finish things up by saying, if you're going to bait deer, just do it intelligently and do it in a manner that is in the best possible manner for the whitetails, for the deer herd, because that is our number one concern, is the health of the herd, the health of the deer. So if you are going to bait deer, do it in a manner that's in the absolute healthiest manner for them. Again, spread it out, broadcast it over a large area. Don't suddenly introduce corn to them, especially in winter, because that can greatly disrupt the enzymes in their stomachs, and in severe cases can starve a deer to death, even if they have a full belly of corn. So do things in a manner, obviously, that follows your culture, follows what you're wanting to do as a deer hunter and is your right to do as a deer hunter if it's legal where you hunt. But also on top of that, do it from the ethical basis. And in my opinion, ethical baiting, where permitted, is going to be baiting done in a manner that is the absolute healthiest and best for the deer, because there is certain types of baiting that you can do that actually is beneficial to the deer, whether that be a protein feed that's really highly digestible, 80-90% digestible, or it's even corn. Deer eat corn everywhere, and corn's not bad for deer. If corn was bad for deer all over the Midwest would have died a long time ago.
Yeah.
So, obviously there are vegetations out there that are higher protein, higher carb, whatever, better for the deer. But corn feeds a lot of deer as a significant percentage of a lot of deer's diets. So, it's not, inherently bad for them, as long as it's implemented in a responsible and ethical and biologically sound way.
1,000% agree, man. Josh, appreciate your time today.
Thank you.
All right, y'all. Well, we are back for the third installment of this controversial baiting topic, if you will. And so we've got none other than Mr. Brian Murphy back on here to talk with us. So, Brian, you've been on the podcast before. Thanks for hopping on with me. Thanks for taking the time. And what I'd like you to do, we got a lot of listeners that know you, but for those that don't, give us just the quick 30,000 foot, or, what I like to call that 30-foot tree stand view of yourself real quick.
Well, thanks, Will. First of all, yeah, I'm a lifelong hunter. Grew up in the outdoors and had a passion to pursue a career in wildlife biology, wildlife management. And that led me to get an undergrad degree in Texas and a graduate degree at the University of Georgia, working specifically on whitetail deer. I had the good fortune of working for the University of Georgia for about 2 years in a deer research function, sort of the liaison between all the grad students and the faculty there, and got to do some really fun, cool whitetail research. Then got an opportunity to go to Australia and be the first deer biologist in their country, which was really a lot of fun, and set up a deer management program there.
Sweet.
And was offered the opportunity to run the Quality Deer Management Association, now known as the National Deer Association. And I was CEO of that for 23 years. And so it's given me the opportunity over those 30 plus years to kind of work all gamuts of deer issues, particularly on the whitetail side. I had the good fortune of working all over whitetails range from South Texas to Maine and everywhere in between. So certainly baiting is not a new issue for me. It's been part of my career. It's a good, easy way to stir up a hornet's nest in a fight among deer hunters in some circles anyway. So, it can be considered a controversial topic. It doesn't have to be. And that's what we're here to talk about today. Kind of delve into some of the nuances of baiting and feeding and the pros and the cons. And hopefully we can do it a fair job. And thanks for letting me be the wrap up here. I don't know if that's good or bad. I haven't got to listen to the two other gentlemen's podcasts yet, so I don't know where this is going to go.
No, and that's exactly how I wanted it. I wanted to make sure that I got everybody's own viewpoint on this without knowing what the other was going to say. And so what I've been asking everybody to get this thing started is, in your opinion and what you've known, and, especially with your background, Brian, why is baiting or, feeding deer considered so controversial in the hunting community?
Well, I think it's first always important when you're getting into a discussion about a subject is to define your terms. And, baiting versus feeding deer, certainly there's a lot of gray area in between those two. But the purposes of my comments anyway, I'll define baiting as the placement of food or some edible substance for deer that will, with its primary purpose of attracting deer either for harvest or photographing, camera surveys, or even viewing or photography. So it's the placement of food item to attract deer. But not with the full intention of trying to provide enough supplemental nutrition to affect, the overall health of the animal. It's an attractant versus how I define supplemental feeding as the placement of a high quality food source, which may differ from a bait, a really high quality, high protein food source that's provided, if not throughout the entire year, most of the year, in what we call an ad lib situation, as much as the deer want to eat or nearly so, enough to make a difference in its nutritional quality of that animal. And so that's how I would define baiting from feeding.
Okay.
And I think it's important also for the listeners to know that the definition of baiting does vary by state. Some class a food item, and we'll say corn for easy example here, but don't include things like, mineral salts and salt blocks and lickables and all the various other formulations. Others do. If it's consumable, if it can be consumed by deer, it's considered bait in some states. So important for any listener to pay close attention to how baiting is defined in their state regulations, because it does vary considerably throughout the whitetails range.
Right. Now, let's talk about the arguments on both sides of the aisle, because I referred to this earlier talking with Josh Dahlke on this in the podcast, but it seems like how bow hunters look at rifle hunters. Those diehard bow hunters are like, rifle hunting's not hunting, bow hunting is. You got to do that, and it's kind of that same concept with baiting for deer, if you will. And so I want to talk about both sides of the aisle here, and I want to get your professional opinion on what are the arguments in favor of it and what are the arguments against it.
Well, the arguments for it, I think, would be fairly self-explanatory to most hunters. Obviously, they're putting it out there to attract deer, that they can view or hunt or kill. And, putting corn or some other supplement out there, certainly under the right circumstances with the right approach, can increase the opportunity to view and or harvest animals. It can be an aid for hunters, particularly new hunters, to see deer and be engaged in hunting early on in their career.
Mm-hmm.
They don't have hunting experience. It is an easier way to get deer in front of you than some of the other old true methods like scouting and boot leather on the ground and all the legwork that it takes otherwise. And that's also a con.
Yeah.
Some would argue that that's taking away from our ability to learn basic woodsmanship and deer scouting tools. So it's obviously a tool that many wildlife managers use for camera surveys and various other things that are important to wildlife management. So it's a tool used for science quite regularly. So baiting has certainly a lot of positive benefits when used correctly, for sure. The negative, ones are basically in two broad buckets. The negatives typically fall under some degree of ethical concern. And the other would be some sort of disease or parasite, congregating deer and therefore increasing disease or parasite transmission.
Right.
Ethics discussion is a complex one, because just as you pointed out, many would argue that putting a pile of corn out there is cheating compared to a food plot. Others would argue that if they're coming to a 1 acre food plot, I can shoot them just as easy as I can over a pile of corn.
Yeah.
Or I can pick the right oak tree dropping in the forest or the right persimmon tree or what have you, and have just as good a luck taking them there. And you rightly said, there's a continuum of sort of ethical discussions out there. Some would argue, the traditional compound hunters would argue that crossbows are cheating.
Mm-hmm.
Crossbow compared to a long range precision rifle, which of those is easier? And if the purists on the compound side were honest, they'd say that, well, I'm probably cheating compared to a stick bow.
Yeah, that's true.
Maybe we got to go back to atlatls and spears. So there is a long continuum of what is ethical, and I'm not here to profess what that is, because ethics are individual, and I would argue that the ethics are less on the method, whether it be baiting or crossbows or whatever fires you up,
right,
are less there and more on the use of that tool and the shots that you take. If you are proficient at 20 yards with a recurve bow and you take a 40-yard shot, whether that's over corn or anything, that's less ethical than you taking a 10-yard shot over a pile of corn in my book. So I think it's the ethics are more how the shots you take under the conditions you take them, and the respect you're giving that animal, not only at the time of shot, but in terms of the effort expended recovering that animal.
Right.
And obviously, what you do with the meat and so forth. So, the ethics one is again for each person to sort of determine on their own. I would also argue is that, the cultural differences in baiting and feeding deer are so varied across the whitetails range.
Big time.
If you were a hunter and you grew up in Texas or Michigan or some of these states that have had baiting for decades on end, it's not even an ethical discussion in most circles.
Mm-hmm.
Get to a state where baiting is either not allowed or is relatively new, you'll find a lot more hunters that get fired up over baiting discussions, because it's new and it's not part of their cultural heritage as a hunter. And so, And, it makes me chuckle because, I spent a lot of time working in all over the Whitetails Range, but Michigan in particular, it seems, had a disproportionate amount of my time over my career. And it wasn't maybe in the last 15 or 20 years, so not long in the big scheme of things, where had always been legal to have, if you wanted a 3-ton pile of carrots or sugar beets, that was perfectly fine to sit in front of literally a dump truck full of, bait. But until somewhat recently, it was considered unethical and even illegal to have an elevated deer stand. You couldn't shoot them from the sky. That's cheating. But you can sit on the ground in front of a dump truck full of carrots or sugar beets. Now this is
what?
But it just shows you that, again, there's a lot of inherent cultural differences that make this discussion almost unique to the person, that person's background, where they live, and just where they themselves draw the line. And of course, there's the public perception too that's often brought up. That's under the ethical basket of concerns that, it's considered cheating or too easy or trickery or what have you. Again, some would try to make the argument that food plots are no different, or some of the other practices that we do that improve early successional habitat that attracts deer in disproportionate numbers. Some of the forest stand work we do and attract deer, to specific areas of the forest. There's a lot of ways that we can manipulate basically the food and cover scenario for deer and, increase our odds. And there's nothing wrong with that. I mean, we are deer hunters and we're out there to harvest deer, and we want to do what helps us do that. I think one of the biggest pros of baiting is the ability to often have a deer out in front of you for several minutes if you need to. That allows those that are involved in, age structure managed deer programs that are trying to harvest deer of specific ages or antler size to really weigh those animals up from a distance and say, yeah, that is a 4-year-old, or that's not, or that's that buck that we're after because I can see that small split G or whatever it is. And often under, a non-baited type scenario, it's very difficult to do that. A deer walks through a gap and, you have to make a split decision, and that does limit your ability to make a more consistently accurate harvest decision.
Yeah, that's a big thing, especially, in Texas on those managed ranches. I mean, it gives them that opportunity. And something I wanted to bring up, from a public perception standpoint, right out of college, me growing up in Texas, hunted on feeders, and right out of college started working for a production company that filmed a lot of hunting shows and fishing shows, and loved the heck out of doing that. But one of the things that just I never fully understood or didn't quite get, when we would film hunts, the way that we would position our pop-up blinds or box blinds, we would have them set up in a way that there would be a tree or a bush that was covering the feeder. And we were told, don't shoot a deer under the feeder, make sure it's off to the side. We don't ever want to have that feeder in the image. And it's just why are we hiding this? I just don't understand it. Growing up, I used to watch some of these hunting shows, South Texas, and it's oh, what are those deer eating on out in the middle of a field? What is it? What kind of food plot they got growing? It's no, it's not what it is. They just got corn broadcasted out in the area, and they just got the feeder off to the side, but they never show it. It's just, it's such a weird thing.
Well, and that's still fairly common to, if you're an astute viewer of outdoor TV, you can see that if that's part of the game.
Oh,
you can kind of, like you said, you could see a deer in South Texas eating out in a coastal wiregrass type field that has nothing for them to eat, and they're browsing steadily among there. It doesn't take a rocket scientist or a deer biologist to figure out what's going on there. And again, that's culturally the norm there. It's not a big deal. It's a way, again, to increase harvest, to meet your harvest goals, your buck management goals. I mean, it is an effective tool, but again, does bring some potential downsides, and one that's increasingly of concern is disease transmission.
Right.
Things like chronic wasting disease. It's now in half the U.S. states, and just recently found Florida. So we got a new state to the list, and the Florida Panhandle. So I'm in Georgia, so it probably won't be long before our first case pops, in Georgia. So and what's interesting though is kind of following this whole baiting sort of scenario for the last couple of decades is that, during the early days of CWD, we saw a slight resistance and sort of a drawback from some states, particularly new areas where they would curb baiting or eliminate it in CWD zones, restrict the amount of bait or types. And then, as CWD has kind of, hate to say, kind of settled in and been a little less controversial of late, we're actually seeing just the opposite happen now, where more and more states are starting to loosen back up on their baiting restrictions. Probably contrary to the best science, but due to hunter demand for a return of those practices, and we're seeing that now. Just saw some recent bills introduced in the last 6 months. I don't really know the status of those bills, but Wisconsin, Mississippi, in particular, a couple of states where I know that there have been moves to sort of relax some of those baiting restrictions in and around CWD areas, And again, I want to be clear, there's no evidence at all anywhere that the bait itself is the problem. The bait does not cause CWD. CWD is transmitted animal to animal contact through blood, saliva, urine, feces, all the different, body things. And of course, anytime you congregate deer at a single focal point, and that is a big distinction between a feed site and a food plot. There is a difference there. Half acre or an acre is a whole lot different than a 10-foot square area when it comes to deer interactions and parasites. And there are other things other than CWD. There are some internal parasites and some other diseases of concern. So in general, concentrating animals at a single focal point for food, it's not a good idea. I mean, long term, it's not in our best interest to do those sorts of things. Not unlike, it wouldn't be a good idea for all of us to line up and suck out of the same water fountain right from the spigot. Certain just general health practices that, make sense. And, if you are a good deer manager and do supplemental feed and or bait and have troughs and that sort of thing, it's a good idea to move those, to periodically clean them, pay attention to basic animal husbandry practices, because that's kind of what you got going on there.
What about on that perspective, Honeycutt, right before you brought up something as well, there's the argument that one of the reasons why baiting in certain states is, being looked upon negatively because of the CWD transmission factor. What about those community scrapes and rubs and licking branches where there's actually urine from many, multiple deer that are going within that? They could, they're licking. So it almost seems like the transmission capability between the disease is higher there than it would be on, say a pile of corn, for example.
Well, I don't know if the science is clear enough to say yes or no here, but I think in general, the difference is, a subset of a deer population are using scrapes or rubs at any one point, whereas if you got feeders out, a much higher percentage of the total deer herd would be using that feed source and urinating and defecating right around that feed source, not unlike what's going on at a scrape. Certainly there's opportunity for disease transmission at scrapes. There's research ongoing looking at that right now. In fact, because of urine deposition at scrapes in particular, that's probably the most concerning one, is urine. And because of that, of course, we've also seen some states, banning natural deer urine products because of that and moving towards synthetics.
Right.
I think that's really a low risk probability compared to many other things out there, frankly, from a CWD perspective. Baiting is certainly something we have control over. We can't control the deer using a scrape.
Right.
We can't control certain things, but state agencies are often put in a very difficult situation because they have a mandate, a legal mandate, to look after the wildlife for eons to come. And because of that, they have to take the most conservative positions. Okay, so often they're going to take a position much more conservative than the average hunter would probably take. And it's kind of the extreme example of that is, groups like the NRA that might take the most extreme position on the other end because they don't want any fallback, they don't want to give any ground. And, agencies are kind of coming from the other end of it where they have to take the most conservative position and control the things they can. They can control to some extent, whether natural deer urine is legal. They can control whether feeding and baiting are legal and under what conditions, where. So I think it's more what they can control, although sometimes I think they chase things that are of not that significant biological importance. Like deer urine is one example. I think there's very minimal gain for an agency to ban urine from a CWD perspective.
Right.
Still in many of those states, captive deer breeders moving live deer all over the state, and hunters bringing carcasses back from CWD positive areas and discarding those. So there are some bigger issues out there that often are overlooked when they chase the minutia. But that's kind of a separate sort of discussion here.
Oh, big time. Yeah, that's a whole other can of worms there.
Yeah.
So to get us back on the baiting part of it, how does deer baiting impact natural behavior and movement patterns of deer, or does it at all?
Yeah, there's actually been some pretty good research done on that. Not surprising, because there's been a lot of questions science has asked around that issue for a long time, and what we typically see is a disproportionate use. Well, let me back up. What we don't see is huge shifts in home ranges. So if a deer's got an established home range, not likely to move 3 properties over to get free corn. Once it's got its established home range, it generally stays pretty tight to that.
Mm-hmm.
From bucks age 2.5 and older. But what we do see is within that home range, the availability, the presence of feed or bait does shift distribution of that deer's activities.
Right.
And, that's not surprising. If you had to make a living on, 1,000 in 2 of those locations, you got a free lunch every time you went by there at the right time, hey, you'll take advantage of that and you'll use that more often. And what we see there is a couple of things. We see, obviously a disproportionate use of those areas. And what we also see around that, and sometimes several acres around those feed sites, is a disproportionate impact on the habitat. Because deer don't always rush right into the feeders, and often will, congregate in and around those feed sites and browse and do what deer do, waiting for their turn or waiting for it to get dark or whatever it is. And so we see a disproportionate, often negative impact on the habitat around those feed sites. So it kind of denotes an area much bigger than the feeder itself.
Mm-hmm.
So we do see that in some of the research. What we also see is again not surprising, is if someone overhunts a bait site, this is called a feeder in this case. If they overhunt that, the deer do tend to become more nocturnal in nature.
Yeah.
So harvest actually goes down. It's kind of contrary to what a lot of hunters might think.
Mm-hmm.
If they overhunt a particular site, their chances are actually lower of taking a deer, particularly a mature deer, does and bucks, because they learn that if they just wait till, while you're walking back to the truck after dark, they can slip in and eat undisturbed, and they'll pattern you the same as they would pattern overhunting any stand, a food plot. Same research holds there too. If you overhunt a food plot, they're going to start coming later. So, that said, there are a couple of big, I think, misnomers when it comes to feed, or we'll say bait. First of all, that corn you put out there does nothing for deer. No protein in it. That's one common statement I hear. You're not doing any good for the deer. You're just throwing, corn on the ground. Second is you can never kill a mature buck over corn or bait. Both of those are falsely, blatantly incorrect, with some caveats.
Yes.
First of all, corn is a high carbohydrate source. Nutritionally, it's almost the same as an acorn. Hunters love acorns. They think acorns, drive deer. Really, they do add some value, but they're energy. They're not high protein. That's true. Corn has 6, 7, 8% max protein, so it's not going to be a huge building block for antler development or that sort of thing, but it does provide energy. And so during the cool months of the year, when deer need more energy than protein, fall, winter months, for example, corn is a perfectly good food source for whitetails. And it does help them in that sense. Does that grow big antlers? No, but at that time of year, they don't need it. Now, during the warmer growing antlers and does are raising their fawns, then yeah, I would concur that you could be doing better for your deer than putting corn out in March, April, May, June, when a higher protein feed would be a better choice. So corn has its role.
Yep.
And I'm using corn as an example because that's the most common one. The second, you can't kill a mature buck over corn. That again depends on how you hunt it, how often you hunt it. You still watch the wind. You still get in and get out undetected. If you use good hunting strategy, it can be a great effective tool. I know many people who have taken, bucks of a lifetime off of bait piles. You don't have to look far in Kansas or Texas or Michigan to find, many people in an audience that raise their hand and say, biggest buck in my life I've killed off, fill in the blank, so, so there's I think some misnomers out there, some anytime you hear a blanket statement on anything in life, it's generally not true. So, those are some of the common things. Now, obviously, as a deer biologist, I'm not a huge fan of baiting when somebody could also justify truly supplemental feeding a deer herd. In other words, improving nutrition. So then, and you can do both. You can have a protein feeder that also attracts them the same as bait would from a hunting perspective.
Right.
If you have the ability to provide a better feed, and importantly, very importantly, you get your habitat in good order first. Supplemental feed is a supplement. It is not the basis of a deer management program, nor is bait. So both of those things should be really considered in a different category altogether than managing the habitat wisely, managing your deer density, doing the basics first before these other practices, come into play. Personally, I've experienced a situation that many hunters have where there's, a term loosely called defensive baiting, where you bait because your neighbors are, and you feel like you have to. You kind of get caught up in the fray.
That's where I thought you were going.
Yeah. So, and that's occurred here in Georgia,
Yep.
where, historically, until I think it was 2019 or 20 or whatever, baiting in the northern half of the state, we were a divided state for a number of years, which is interesting, where you could bait in the southern half of our state legally, you couldn't in the northern half.
Interesting.
The northern half of the state clamored loud enough, long enough that they wanted it too. And so now it's statewide. And none of the properties around us, obviously baited in the past because it was illegal, and very few of them supplementally fed. You could supplementally feed under certain guidelines, but you couldn't bait. I know there's a fine nuance there.
Right.
Once baiting became legal, now we've got a number of small landowners around where I hunt who do bait aggressively. And so it's kind of put us in the situation of almost feeling like we have to put some bait out occasionally just to kind of compete, with the neighbors. And that's kind of a sad state to me personally. That's just me personally. I'm not
agree.
I'm not a purist. I'll state that for the record. I have taken a few deer over bait.
Right.
I don't to. I prefer to hunt them, a little different than that. But if I go to a place and that's the way they do it, and that's the only way I can hunt, then when in Rome, so to speak. So I'm not an ethical purist there.
Mm-hmm.
But so there are certainly, like I said, plenty of reasons to say there are some advantages, and then there's probably an equal, if not slightly greater number of disadvantages long term, for deer herd health and some of the other concerns that we have.
And talking about your neighbors there, I mean, I feel like this is a public statement announcement, I should say, or whatever you want to call it. But, we've got neighbors ourselves. We hunt low fence here in Texas. And, the first few years that I started hunting this property that we're on, we knew we had neighbors over there, and they'd had one, maybe two feeders within 100, 150 yards of our fence line. And I don't know if they caught wind of us killing big bucks, because there would be deer that would come from their property to ours. And we had some really good mature bucks we were killing for about 2 or 3 years. Last year, they've got 4 different feed sites within about a 150 to 200 yard span, no further than 60 yards right off of our fence. And I'm like, guys, come on now. So,
well, see, that's where I would consider the ethics of baiting not being the bait, but how that person is using the bait. That's where it becomes such a very difficult situation. And there was a great property. This was now 20 odd years ago, when baiting was still kind of in its early infancy in some areas, at least. And there was a property in South Carolina that was documented well, where they went to the absolute extreme.
Mm-hmm.
They came out with, they bought corn by the 10-ton loads, had silos full, and would run big, fertilizer spreader trucks down every road. They put out tonnage of corn that you can't even imagine. And it was a commercial hunting operation, and they harvested more deer than that property could hold by any measure. In other words, deer would, and they had enough hunters on there because of commercial, they were in a high
Mhm.
number of commercial hunters. If a deer even made one trip across that property looking for that corn, they didn't come home. And they literally drained several thousand acres around them of deer because
Mhm.
they would consistently kill more deer than they could. They couldn't have held. They were shooting an equivalent of like 100 deer per square mile, killing.
Wow.
And you can't run that many, let alone harvest that many sustainably, unless you're drawing them in big numbers from neighboring properties. So they created a huge sink, a vacuum. That, that's an extreme example, but like you
Mhm.
said, there are, it is frustrating, particularly for what I would say the more ardent deer manager type folks that might be managing a few hundred, maybe even a few thousand acres, and really doing it right, trying hard. And then you got a 20-acre neighbor that sets up shop next to you with five feeders, and they shoot a disproportionate number of deer relative to anything they could do on their own. That's where some of the rub comes in with baiting and feeding, and those
Yep.
are real concerns, real life situations that cause a lot of, frustration and anxiety among deer hunters.
Right. And there becomes a point too where it almost becomes a safety matter because, some of this, I'll use our situation for example. You can see their deer blind from our cabin, and it's like, guys, it kind of makes you wonder. We've got a field between us and it's where they're deer hunting. It's like, what's going to stop them when we're not there to shoot a deer that's in the middle of our field? Then it becomes like,
Yeah.
well, are they going to be shooting near you, towards you? What if they miss? And it's just it's a very frustrating situation, and it just boils down to be a good neighbor.
Yeah, exactly. There's a couple other issues that comes up with baiting and feeding, and one is non-target consumption, and the impact on populations of wild hogs,
Ah,
raccoons, possums, all those other things that are predators for certain ground nesting birds and various other things. If turkeys are an issue in your area, turkey decline is common across much of its range now, and there are a lot of reasons for that. But
yeah.
nest predators are one. And we've seen just an incredible explosion in raccoon populations and some of the other nest predators in the
Yes.
last couple of years or last several years. And there are people trapping hundreds of raccoons off given properties
Yeah.
now. And if you have a ad lib feed that is open to your deer herd, as long as it's something raccoons or hogs will eat, which is almost everything, then you have a chance to really exacerbate your problems there. There's decent evidence that these perennial feed sites, bait stations, are ambush sites for predators on deer. That just as deer will learn that they can get a free lunch at a corn pile or a deer feeder, so too will a coyote, a bobcat, a bear, whatever. That they know if they set up shop near those, they can ambush some deer there.
Hmm.
So you're kind of bringing your deer to a potential demise to a predator. Those are concerns. If you do use corn, many hunters are aware of a toxic substance called aflatoxin that can be included in moldy corn. And turkeys have a very low tolerance to aflatoxins and will die in pretty good numbers at fairly low levels of this compound. Deer,
Man.
thankfully, have a very high resistance to it, so you're not hurting your deer too bad typically, but
Yeah.
can be negative for turkeys and some other bird species. So, there's certainly some issues that need to be considered before anybody jumps into to baiting or feeding, and just kind of think through and it's costly.
Hmm.
Heck, a bag of corn. I profess I've got a deer feeder in my couple acres here in my neighborhood. I like to see deer. They're neighborhood deer. I don't hunt them, so I spend a little corn out, and love to view deer. But bag of corn has doubled in price in the last year or so. So
Yes.
even corn, what used to be dirt cheap, is 10, 12, $15 a bag
Hmm.
in many areas. And if you get into a true supplemental feeding program where you're buying a protein pellet or some protein sweet feed of some sort, or cottonseed or whatever it is you feed, those things have skyrocketed also. So you better be in it for a pretty thick wallet if you want to get serious with it.
Yeah, and that's where having good lease mates, or if you got buddies that you're sharing it with, that's where that can help out. We do that on our place. We split the protein, the corn, and coming back to your nest predators. One of the things that we've kind of seen, and including pigs, we've put pins. We've built pins around our protein in corn feeders, and number one, it's helped mitigate the amount of pigs that come into our property now, because it's almost like they've learned that they can't get it, that there's no way to get it now, which is nice. But to the raccoon thing, since we really started heavily feeding and baiting year round, what we've kind of felt and seen, we used to have low turkey numbers, and we didn't realize how many raccoons and armadillos are out there. But what this has helped us actually do is concentrate them to these areas where we can then trap them and get rid of them effectively. I mean, I think we killed close to 70 on our property alone the year prior, and we've actually seen a pretty good little bump. Like, we've seen more turkeys than we've ever seen before. And we're like, man, hopefully that's come from us, getting rid of these suckers,
Absolutely. No, excluding pigs, it's common practice in South Texas in many areas too to exclude javelinas.
Yep.
Same sort of thing, because they're corn hounds pretty bad. Excluding certain animals. Obviously, if it's a 24, 36-inch fence, that's going to stop most of your hogs, but will also preclude some of your fawns from getting in at early stages of life. So there are some drawbacks there, but I think the pluses outweigh those. If the doe is healthy, she's going to be giving the fawn what it needs long enough to jump the fence. So I say those are good ideas, and like you said, as long as you're willing to get into the trapping business, certainly having feed sites allows you to concentrate your efforts and be more successful there, and you'll be a whole lot more efficient reducing nest predator numbers around feed sites than you will just randomly trapping the landscape.
Yeah, absolutely.
So, all those are absolutely spot on comments, and in line with what we're seeing throughout the country.
Definitely. On your fawn comment there, what we've kind of done, because that was one of my concerns when we built these pens, because normally what I used to do was try and cut holes in the panels to allow fawns to get under and at least try to get some of the protein that's been knocked on the ground. And we just saw the pigs, thought I cut them small enough, but those pigs, they'll get through anything. And so what I've tried to do this year is we've got those broadcast corn feeders, shove them to the side where it still broadcasts some of that corn right there, where if mama is in there getting some protein, then she can keep her fawn close by, which I've actually seen in a few cell cam images that there's a fawn right there eating on it. Mama's inside. So
Gotcha.
we're thinking it's working. So, one of the questions I've asked both Joshes, Dahlke and Honeycutt, and you talked about this earlier, what is the main difference between a pile of corn and a food plot for that argument's sake,
Well, I think there are some fundamental differences. The first just being sweat equity, the amount of effort it takes to grow a food plot versus, so some would argue that, the rewards are greater the more effort invested. That may resonate with some. I think the biggest ones are the size and the availability. The size of a food plot, obviously, half acre even, is far greater in size than a small feeder. A single location. The availability of a food plot is there 24/7. It's available for everything that wants it. And there are many small mammals, songbirds, butterflies, bees, pollinators, all kinds of things that can take advantage of a food plot that, some of which wouldn't take advantage of a feed source otherwise. So I think those are some of the fundamental differences. Obviously, the mouth to mouth type contact disease transmission is fundamentally different. Licking the bottom of a trough or eating on the ground where 20 other deer in that 24-hour period have defecated or walked, and versus however many thousand square feet there are in a half acre food plot, the opportunity for disease parasite transmission does vary as well. A good food plot, particularly summer food plots, big soybean, sorghum fields, etc., are good habitat. They're good fawning. You're providing some additional habitat. If you are amending your soils well in a food plot situation, you're improving soil health on your property. So I think there are a lot of fundamental differences when it comes to two.
Right.
Whether that's enough for you to say yes or no from an ethical perspective is really to each individual to determine. But there certainly are differences.
Absolutely. Well, Brian, before we go, I got one last question for you, and I feel like this is probably going to be a pretty open-ended question, or I'll get an open-ended answer just because there's so many viewpoints, and I could be wrong on that. But would you say the bulk of wildlife managers or biologists like yourself, professionals, view deer baiting, and if or any, what are their concerns with it?
Well, I can't speak for all the fraternity of biologists out there, but certainly I think there's a common thread that in a perfect world, which doesn't exist, in a perfect world, most would prefer baiting not be legal, just because of the headaches and hassles and some of the drawbacks. That said, some would argue vehemently for it, and probably even many of the camp that would say we don't want deer baiting allowed would still be neutral to slightly positive on supplemental feeding. So that shows you kind of the continuum there is kind of challenging. And of course, I mentioned earlier that I worked for many years with the Quality Deer Management Association. And our position then, and I can't speak for that organization because I don't work for them any longer, and I think their position stays true to this day, that where it exists and culturally accepted, and no known disease issues, no CWD, it's been around, it's there. There's no real effort to try to go out and get rid of it. However, that organization historically opposed the introduction of baiting where it didn't already exist. So if it didn't exist, they would oppose it. If it was already there and kind of culturally ingrained, you're probably not going to get it removed at that point. But as I said, what's interesting is we're actually seeing a proliferation now of baiting opportunity. The last time I looked, roughly half the states in the U.S. With whitetails in them allowed baiting. About half didn't. Of those who allowed baiting, about 2/3 allowed it statewide, and about 1/3 had some prohibition on state WMAs, public land. In the South, where a lot of our land is leased from timber companies, some timber companies don't allow baiting, some do.
Mm-hmm.
Some states baiting's kind of unrestricted, just kind of do what you want within reason. Others, there are limits on the amount of bait. Alabama, I think, is one of the few states, maybe the only state, that requires that if you wish to bait in Alabama, you have to buy a permit. I think it's $15 a year for residents. I think it's $51 for a non-resident. So you have to buy a baiting permit. So there's a lot of nuance when it comes to how baiting is defined, where you can do it. In most cases, if it's legal in the state, it certainly would be legal on private land. But when it comes to public land or leased land, that's where sometimes those landowners say, I know it's legal in the state, but we're not allowing it on these classification of lands. So again, you have to be real careful there. I would say that law enforcement issues over baiting has been a long issue, particularly where it wasn't legal, because many hunters, let's say bent the rules and put out bait anyway, and so that caused a lot of issues. And actually, we've seen that, now that baiting's legal in many areas, we've seen the number of infractions go down. Many of those hunters are now legal.
Yeah.
So, if they got caught or didn't get caught, well, now they can do it without repercussions. So, they're doing it there. So again, it's a huge issue, but yet it doesn't have to be as controversial as I think it's often made out to be.
Mm-hmm.
Again, as a deer biologist, if CWD were in my area or some other infectious disease, I would argue strongly that we shouldn't have it there. That's one thing we can control, and if that minimizes disease spread, that's something we can do. However, if there's no known disease issues and culturally practiced, and there are some habitats that are just so thick and so hard to hunt that hunters would be largely unsuccessful in some cases without bait. And it is a way for a new hunter to have a high probability of at least seeing a deer.
Mm-hmm.
Will that help at the recruitment level of keeping that hunter engaged? Is that a fair way to start a hunter, to kind of get them started, and they can progress, if you will, away from baiting? Somewhat, that same argument's often used with crossbows. Hey, let's get them hooked on archery, if you consider crossbows archery. Let's get them hooked on archery, and then if they graduate, quote unquote, to a compound or a recurve, so it's it can be used like anything as a positive, or it can be used as a negative. It's so site specific and culturally specific and ethics specific to a person that it's hard to generalize anything when it comes to bait.
Absolutely. And to kind of your point there, getting people introduced with it so they, get introduced in a good way to hunting and not think about how hard it could be, or, because there's times where we go and sit and don't see deer. And, it's just nice to have that for somebody new. And growing up in Texas, I loved it. But at the same time, I love going to Nebraska, where last I understood, haven't been there in about a year, could have changed this year, but you can't hunt over bait or minerals or within 200 yards. And so I loved the challenge that posed, because it's like, okay, now I have to think differently from, I don't have a deer feeder in front of me. So what can I do strategically to put myself in a better position to have higher odds at killing a deer? And so there's different ways to look at it, like you said. And I know we're running out of time here, but any last comments or any things that you would love to talk about just in regard to our whole baiting forum here, if you will? I've loved having this podcast with everybody on it. So just looking to see if you got any final comments on it.
No, I don't think there's any final words of wisdom other than for each hunter to just take a moment and reflect on what's important to them. And if baiting is part of that and that satisfies their needs. I'll use my daughter as an example. Been an ardent hunter since she could walk with me, taking close to 100 whitetails. Hunted most of her young career here in Georgia when baiting was not legal. Even though baiting is legal, we do not bait on our Georgia property. It's just our choice. I have taken her to South Texas, and she was able to harvest 2 super dandy, bucks over bait.
Mm-hmm.
And she was thrilled with those opportunities. I got to be with her on both occasions. We got to judge and age those animals and make sure they met the landowner's requirements, which they did. Allowed her to make an ethical shot in both cases. That's great. But I will share a comment she shared, and this is just her take. It's not mine, and I didn't force this on her. She also killed a 5-year-old free-range buck in Georgia that was 120 inches. These 2 in Texas were 150 plus. She said, "Dad, I love that. I don't think I ever had as much fun seeing so many bucks in Texas and having all those big deer around me." She said, "But one I'm most proud of is this 120-inch 5-year-old Georgia buck that she shot on her own. She aged and judged it herself, passed it the first time, and ended up making a great shot and taking it hunting solo." That to her is a greater accomplishment than the 2 bucks she took in Texas over a fed Sendero.
Yeah.
That's her decision.
Yes.
And I won't impose that on her. And again, I make my own decisions, and every hunter does. So it becomes a personal choice on what's important to you. But just understand that there are risks. There are some downsides, and they need to be considered. They're real.
Yeah.
It's not the end of the world stuff that some would make it out to be, but there are real concerns there that we need to be aware of, particularly in disease areas. And also, I think the final words is just understand what your state agency is mandated to do. And some of the decisions they make with baiting and feeding and minerals and urine, you may not agree with, but just understand the complex situation that they face from a legal mandate to look after the resource for the next 1,000 years if we're fortunate enough to be around long enough to enjoy that. So that would be my parting comments.
Love it, man. Well, Brian, I appreciate your time today. Always love getting you on the podcast. Every time I do, I learn something new. So, man, thanks for your time today.
My pleasure. Anytime, Will.
All right, y'all, there you go. Hopefully we didn't rub too many people the wrong way talking about baiting and feeding, and hopefully we brought some insight to maybe change some of y'all's minds that you might have a little bit of a negative insight on feeding. Either way, remember, y'all, check your local state laws and regulations wherever you live. If you live in a state where baiting and feeding is legal, I definitely recommend it. I do it myself. I live in Texas. So again, y'all, we just want to thank y'all for tuning in to the HuntStand Podcast. We appreciate the support. Make sure you rate, review, subscribe to the podcast. Your ratings and reviews really help. If you got ideas for podcasts and things that we haven't talked about or things you want us to talk about, let me know. Send me an email. I'll put my email in the description below. I want to know what you think. But remember, y'all, rate, review, subscribe. Thanks again for tuning in, and we'll see you on the next one.